Hello and welcome to Kepster ADV, the channel dedicated to riding, adventure, and life's journey, which is always best made on a motorcycle. Today I'm coming to you from the Shiloh Civil War Battleground in southwestern Tennessee. This was one of the most important battles of the Civil War. Now, the Union soldiers were trying to work their way down to Corinth, Mississippi, where there was two supply route railroad tracks that were very important to the Confederate Army. So they were trying to get down there to take those over, and this was kind of the last line of defense before the Confederates were defeated here and ended up falling back to Corinth to defend that territory. Now, I am not a Civil War historian, so I'm not going to go into a lot of the details. I've read some of it, and it's very complicated with the different generals and the different units that were involved in the battles here. But I'm going to show you some of this area, and I would urge you to, if you're in the area in southwestern Tennessee, to come take a look for yourself, or even to look it up online, because it's a fascinating story and a really bloody, important battle during the Civil War. The area I'm in right now is called Pittsburgh Landing, and this was a very important spot. We're right on the banks of the Tennessee River, and the Union had a fleet of steamships that they used to bring in troops and supplies. So I'm going to turn you around and show you what I'm talking about here. So in this small area right here, the Union steamboats would have been lined up, and they dropped off 44,000 Union troops to join the battle. And just up the river, a little past those trees, there was an area where a Union gunship stopped and was able to fire cannons at Confederate positions. Right now I'm standing in front of Duncan Field. This is a spot where some of the bloodiest fighting of the Civil War took place. Now, to the left side of the field here was lined with Union soldiers, and the Confederates came in from the other side to try to push them back, and they kind of met here in this field. This was the Duncan farm, and a lot of the fighting took place right here in the field of Duncan's farm. There was thousands of men killed. This place would have been just lined with dead bodies. I'm standing in front of a long line of cannons, and these cannons extend back almost as far as the eye can see. This was like the largest concentration of cannons used in the war. There was 50 of them here. Now, we're still at Duncan Field, so there was a strong defense of Union soldiers across the field, and they were able to hold that position. And the Confederates knew that they weren't going to be able to just use the cavalry alone to break them up. So they brought in all these cannons, and they were firing the cannons across the field here at the Union positions on the other side of Duncan's field. It's crazy to imagine that one day this was a farm where a family lived and they were growing crops and earning a living, and the next day it was the site of one of the bloodiest battles of the Civil War. I'm standing in front of the Shiloh Church, and this was an area where Sherman had his Union soldiers camped out. So the whole area would have been filled with tents and just an encampment for the Union soldiers. And they were here and they were attacked from the trees. Now I'm going to walk you into the trees so you can see just how thick the woods are here, and the amount of confusion that it caused with all the fire coming from it seemingly everywhere in the trees led to a lot of casualties at this spot also. We're going to go and take a little peek inside the church here. They have it open. So this is the actual original church that stood here. with a hymn book. Now I'm walking into the woods here. There's a little trail that leads to another monument. But I wanted to take you in here just to show you how thick and how dense these woods are. And this made retreats and advances very difficult for the soldiers on both sides. So I'm going to just kind of turn the camera around and show you what I'm talking about here. You can imagine this is probably very much what it looked like at the time of the Civil War, with living trees and deadfall, not to mention the amount of trees that would have been knocked over by cannon fire and what have you. And you get thousands of men in these thick woods fighting, and they wouldn't have been able to really see each other very well until they got fairly close. And a lot of the fighting here was in pretty close quarters. The area I'm standing in now is referred to as the impenetrable thicket or the hornet's nest. And this is an area where there was a big skirmish between the Union and Confederate forces, and the Union were able to drive back the Confederates and gain some ground on them, ground that would be gained back later by the Confederates. But it was a really dense thicket, and it made mobility for both sides really difficult. And there was a firefight going on, and some of Grant's men brought in these cannons and were using the cannons to fire into the positions where the Confederate soldiers were. Now, on the morning of April 6, 1862, this field would have been filled with a disorganized mess of Union soldiers. They had suffered a lot of losses due to casualties, and also losses of equipment, food, you name it. So they were all gathered here, and they were going to be pushed back by the Confederates, but Ulysses S. Grant found an opportunity to turn this into an actual offensive, and it was quite successful against the Confederate Army. The area I'm standing in front of now, that's outlined in cement and black balls, is a mass gravesite for Confederate soldiers that were killed. The Union, when they won, they were kind of tasked with burying the dead. And so the enemy soldiers, they would have been buried with the same amount of reverence that some of their own would have been. And so there's several places around the site here where there was mass graves dug, and they just threw the bodies of the dead Confederates in there and covered them up. One of the most famous sites for this battle was the Bell Farm, and that's to my right. And right behind me is the Bloody Pond. Now, there was a lot of the most violent fighting that took place that occurred in this area on April 6th and April 7th, 1862. And during these battles, there was a lot of people killed, a lot of wounded, a lot went missing. There was people who were following other regiments because they couldn't find their own. They weren't sure where their leadership was. So the battle got very confusing at this point. And there was a lot of people killed in this area. And in fact, the story about the pond is that there was so many people killed in this area that their blood ran into the pond and turned it red. There were more than 23,000 casualties during the Battle of Shiloh, most notably Confederate General Albert Johnston. Johnston rallied his troops by horseback near the front of the line, where he was shot below his right knee. Within an hour, he bled to death. Many speculate that if not for this loss, there may have been a different outcome to the battle. The carnage at Shiloh was unprecedented and gave Shiloh the distinction of having more casualties than all previous engagements on American soil combined.